History of Mental Health by Juan Luis Cortez Cervantes. Lesson number 7. The First Steps and Setbacks of Mental Health. Although we have described Jacques Lacan's work as separate from the policy of the World Health Organization, his efforts to separate psychoanalysis from ethics and medical practice date back to his beginnings as a psychoanalyst. We have that during the Bonneval Psychiatric Conference, held in the psychiatric hospital of that French town, on September 28, 1946, Lacan held a debate with his colleague, Dr. Henry E.Y. An event that would produce the text called About Psychic Causality, where Lacan formulates the following phrase: "The being of man not only cannot be understood without madness, but it would not be the being of man if it did not carry madness within it as the limit of freedom." In this phrase you can observe Lacan's particular style, with phrases that can contain many meanings that inherently come from the reader or listener or interpreter. This dynamic in its transmission of psychoanalysis forces the reader to take a stance, a position, or a party, and therefore to expose himself in the construction of meaning. Thus, the following commentary on a single sentence by Lacan reveals the subjectivity or perspective of the creator of this course. The words, "the being of man," which are repeated twice in the phrase, seek to point to the very essence of humanity. We could also understand them as what makes us human. Then, Lacan introduces 3 negations. The first 2, the phrase, "not only cannot," can be understood as one. This phrase is formulated to point out something obvious or something that is at the same time as natural as it is simple, as revealing, as horrible, as unnameable, which turn out to be all characteristics of the unconscious mind or soul in the texts of Sigmund Freud. The next words, "without the madness." Whether we take the 2 negations as one, which would be the same as an accent or an affirmation and would be equivalent to pointing out madness as the essence of the human being, or appealing to the double nature of language by pointing out the presence of an element through its negation. This being so, the first part of Lacan's phrase could be reformulated without altering its meaning with the following phrase: "the very nature of the human being is contained in the madness." The second part of the phrase says, "but it would not be the being of man if he did not carry madness within it as the limit of freedom." It makes us notice the circularity of Lacanian thought. For this part of the phrase, we will leave aside the turns that Lacan takes in his phrases with negation, since the first word, but it forces the interpreter to give free rein to his perception. Although, like a good obsessive, I began by counting the repetitions of the words "no" or their derivatives, this word, but, is rather a nonsense in the desire to count words and attribute logical meanings. Going back and forth and going again, and then not knowing where the interlocutor is going. Therefore, I will directly integrate the words of the second part without negations. They are understood like this: "the very nature of the human being is contained in the madness that, the being of man, carries madness within it as the limit of freedom." Or, in other words, we have the madness as a category or word that teaches us the ever-present freedom of the human soul, as necessary as it is dangerous. That freedom would be the source of both science itself and the reason for human conflicts, in not finding a way to define normality when we are so many and so different in our lives and perspectives. And this was a brief analysis of a single decontextualized sentence from the work of French psychiatrist Jacques Lacan. A phrase that in its style has as many complications as dimensions, as rich in its content as it is difficult to read. Michel Foucault joined in from philosophy to Lacan's approach to the history and evolution of psychoanalysis. Publications such as Discipline and Punish from 1975 and History of Madness from 1961, where Foucault clearly stated that mental health was not a scientific discovery, but a social construction that was aimed at the extreme and unjustified surveillance of actions and thoughts. The following is an excerpt from the book, A History of Madness in the Classical Age, by Michel Foucault. Madness cannot be found in the wild state. Madness only exists in a society. It does not exist outside the forms of sensitivity that isolate it and the forms of repulsion that exclude or capture it. Note that both authors, Lacan and Foucault, speak openly of madness, when psychiatry refuses to associate the dyad health or mental illness with such a word or category. The following is a quote from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in its third edition published in 1980. A mental disorder is conceptualized as a clinically significant behavioral or psychological syndrome or pattern. Neither deviant behavior, for example, political, religious, or sexual, nor conflicts between the individual and society are mental disorders, unless the deviance or conflict are symptoms of a dysfunction in the person. That is, as if the institution that was gradually taking its political leadership said, "We do not treat crazy people or people who think or act in a certain way in the political, religious, or sexual sphere." Or at least not, until that same person has a conflict with their own way of being. In this sense, what mattered was the so-called diminished function of the person to take its characteristics as an object of study and treatment in the clinical setting. However, the dysfunctional character of the individual was taken as something that occurred or determined on its own, without any social, temporal, or cultural factor intervening in the human phenomenon, and without considering it as a form of adaptation to conditions unknown to medical authorities. At this point, we can already notice that the figure of the doctor begins to be diffuse for the medical authorities themselves. Should mental illness be self-diagnosed rather than pointed out by a doctor? At that time, it was not known. Another important consideration is that the manual spoke of a dysfunction of the individual, not of a decrease or affectation in any trait of the individual. That is to say, the supposed patient had to say, "I am inferior," before anyone else, and then allow himself to be evaluated by a doctor so that his opinion of himself could be confirmed. But, given that the manual indicated the behavior or disorder according to their own words, by pointing it out in the manual, such a characteristic of the subject was immediately indicated as dysfunctional. That is to say, the same diagnostic manual did not take into account the interpretation that anyone could make of its content. Let's take an example. Suppose an individual from any culture consumed 10 cans of beer a day. If we take the fact as an isolated event, that individual would be an alcoholic anywhere in the world where that said subject was observed. But this is where the gap in interpretation existed that no medical authority considered. That observation towards the person who drank 10 cans of beer could come from some representative of medicine, psychology, or psychiatry, or from any individual who took the diagnostic criteria as their reference. However, even within North American society, where the diagnostic manuals that shaped the professional practice of mental health were written and published, we cannot cancel out that said event or behavior of the subject obeys social, economic, or even survival interests of certain individuals. And yet, the diagnostic criterion was maintained as a kind of evaluation that no one asked of a hypothetical subject that does not exist and to satisfy a demand that does not come from someone who sustains or survives in the most diverse conditions that are indicated as pathological or unhealthy in the various diagnostic manuals. In this way, it is worth asking, to what interests does the existence of such clinical categories obey? And what does the manual specifically refer to with the clinical environment that medicine seeks to support, without society and without the criteria of the individuals who do or support themselves in various activities? There was no clear answer. But there was a presumption of relevant diagnostic criteria based on evidence. Thus, while Lacan and Foucault lead the European scene, in North America a movement with a strong religious edge was born that opposed the role that medicine had recently acquired. This movement called itself anti-psychiatry. It was led by David Cooper along with R.D. Laing, and was reinforced by the work of Thomas Szasz and his work, The Myth of Mental Illness, from 1961. Many left-wing or dissident Christian sectors adopted anti-psychiatry because they saw psychiatric diagnosis as a form of oppression that dehumanized others, something contrary to the charity and freedom of conscience that was required to embrace any religious denomination. Without freedom, there is no religion. Without religion, there is no notion of will, freedom, and responsibility, at least for certain sectors of society. Little by little, the implications of the words mental health were echoed in Western society, while Eastern societies were less concerned with persecuting crazy people or calling them dysfunctional. Eastern societies ended up sticking to immediate methods to define and sustain their respective societies. in such a way that in China, communist policy dominated any efforts at normalization. In Japan, the state imposed itself on incoherent subjects with institutionalization programs. That is, a kind of non-prison confinement. And in India, their independence from the British Empire left them in a precarious social and economic situation, which in turn generated social assistance programs to address the problem of alienated individuals. Although some form of public execution on subjects who could not be understood, or who were rather aggressive, should not be unusual either. Confinement, whether for political, security, or even religious reasons, was encouraged in all these societies towards subjects who could not integrate into civilization or the ideal of the state, or did not want to go where the authorities wanted to take them. Where politics and religion ruled, science was silent, at least from the Western point of view, because as we have seen, this separation between science and religion is specifically Western and is relatively recent. A few years before these American cultural demonstrations against public mental health policy, a scientific and cultural movement was taking shape again in the United States. Albert Ellis developed rational emotive behavioral therapy in 1955 after abandoning psychoanalysis as he considered it inefficient, slow, and unscientific. Unlike psychoanalysis, according to Albert Ellis, which looked for past unconscious traumas, rational emotive behavioral therapy focused on the present, is active and directive, and changes conscious irrational beliefs to eliminate emotional disturbance, achieving faster results. Note here the lack of context about all these observations, as if for that moment in the history of humanity psychoanalysis was characterized by being a single practice or method. What kind of experience did Albert Ellis call psychoanalysis? We don't know. We don't know if Albert Ellis went to orthodox psychoanalysis. We don't know if he went to a Lacanian psychoanalyst. We don't know if he went to an eclectic psychoanalyst. We don't really know what Albert Ellis called psychoanalysis. However, the alleged results obtained by Ellis were not enough to satisfy a growing demand for mental health, which remained not clearly defined and yet was requested everywhere. In this way, again and within North American society, Aaron Beck founded cognitive therapy, again in opposition to an undefined psychoanalysis. Seeking to focus on the here and now as a functional proposal for therapy, Aaron Beck, like Albert Ellis, is also unclear about what he calls psychoanalysis. But both theories are beginning to gain ground in the training of psychologists around the world. With Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, the notion of evidence-based therapy was born, which would begin to be demanded academically in the training of professionals in psychology. However, it is necessary to point out that this demand is not fully established in the training of psychologists throughout the world. Despite claiming to be science and seeking to defend the exclusion of psychoanalysis and canceling its influence on psychology curricula, only in English-speaking countries can it be presumed that psychology is, according to them, based on evidence. Although that word evidence hides a considerable limitation of the procedures to reduce them to a kind of recipes for mental health. Recipes that not only ignore the conditions under which a human being develops, but also the very criteria and freedom of that human being who is considered in advance as a sick person. Now, it is fair to point out these limitations of the real scope of the so-called therapy, because little by little the word was acquiring a different meaning from that of medicine, precisely because of those inherent difficulties of each society and each culture when defining what was considered health and specifically pointing out the figures that can provide relief to the different ailments that occur in them. In such a way that even by the year 2026, the date of publication of this course, a person in any Western society can seek some kind of relief in therapies based on scientific evidence, or in alternative therapies, or perhaps in religious practices, or self-help groups, or simply in their consumption of some substance, whether legal or illegal. Generally, a person does not have to know what doctors or their political authorities think to find ways to live and feel good about themselves. And although relief can come by any means, the idea of mental health derived from a contact between a suffering individual and a health professional is sustained, who, as we can remember, was historically linked to religion from the beginning of their journeys in human culture. On this point, and in the strict sense, science cannot be taken as an authoritarian practice, since if it were, it would lose its social function of creating knowledge, methods, and the permanent search for effective truth. Thanks to these and many other authors who began their books with the phrase, "I am not a psychoanalyst," or similar phrases, there was no longer a psychoanalysis that was limited to proposing the analysis of patients, not as a path to mental health or well-being that medical authorities spoke of, but as a new and different human relationship. With the flourishing of thousands of therapies based on science, evidence, or any other promise of gratification, people began to talk about a therapy that little by little ceased to have specific limits, such as physical health. But, strictly speaking, in university circles there was talk of a deficient psychoanalysis, without really being able to define it, while among mainly North American professors and students they began to talk about therapies that offered, in their own words, quick solutions to the practical needs of patients, inadvertently undermining every notion of human autonomy. Solutions that included, in their words, modifying thoughts to change emotions, in comparison with the supposed long-term psychoanalysis of the past, as psychoanalysis was defined from the nascent North American therapies. And despite maintaining its practice as a supposed revolution in psychology, once again evidence-based therapy would not provide the solutions that the paranoid world created by the atomic bomb needed. In this way, in the 1980s, we have a scenario composed of a psychoanalysis divided between the International Psychoanalytical Association, the international organization founded by Sigmund Freud. On the other hand, a World Association of Psychoanalysis, an organization founded by Jacques Lacan, North American therapies, self-help groups, and mental health that pointed everywhere without being able to define clear methods and objectives. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association, calling itself American, but being strictly made up of United States professionals, published its Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 3rd edition. This publication was important because it left neurosis out of its diagnostic criteria, mainly to mark a transition from a psychoanalytic approach based on unconscious causes and the structure of personality towards a medical, descriptive and empirical approach, focused on symptoms, according to them, observable and measurable, and, of course, cementing the institutional foundations of the change to evidence-based therapy. Note that at that time the International Classification of Diseases already existed and that publication would not eliminate neurosis until 1990. The medical world said goodbye to neurosis, but still did not recognize the conflict that the medical community had founded for humanity in general by its efforts to bring, carry, or create mental health. On the side of psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan, the most important figure of the analytical movement after Sigmund Freud, would die in Paris on September 9, 1981, and his school would become part of a movement with countercultural inclinations or overtones. Lacanian psychoanalysis is drawn as alien to Marxism-Leninism and at the same time from capitalism, separated from mental health and politics in general, and without presenting alternative proposals in the face of the lack of its founder. From its other stronghold, after Freud's death, the International Psychoanalytical Association would seek to maintain an impartial policy in the face of events taking place throughout the world. Due to these factors, psychoanalysis in general as a scientific and cultural movement enters a state of stasis worldwide. It exists, but in silence in the face of the great political and social movements. The two institutions representing Freudian thought would continue organizing conferences, but separated from each other and from the rest of the world by an almost universalized demand for mental health. However, this separation is not entirely negative, as we will see.